In a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of downtown, Marcus Thompson thought he was dealing with just another defenseless woman. The sound of his palm connecting with her cheek echoed through the suddenly silent room. But what happened next would change everything he thought he knew about power, respect, and the consequences of his actions. Because the petite brunette standing before him, rubbing her reddened cheek with an eerily calm expression, wasn't just any woman. She was Lieutenant Sarah Storm Martinez, a decorated Navy SEAL who had survived 3 combat tours and taken down terrorists twice her size. And Marcus was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous people come in the most unexpected packages. This is the true story of how one man's moment of violence became a life-changing lesson about courage, justice, and the extraordinary people who walk among us every day, hiding their strength behind ordinary appearances. Sarah Martinez had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. After completing her latest training mission with SEAL Team 7, she finally had a chance to meet her college roommate, Jennifer, for drinks. The Anchor Bar wasn't fancy, but it held memories from their university days when they would come here to celebrate passing exams or to forget about failed relationships. Now, at 28, Sarah found herself craving these simple moments of normalcy. She sat at their usual corner table, dressed in civilian clothes that felt strange after weeks in military gear. Her dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and she wore minimal makeup, preferring to let her natural features show. To anyone looking at her, she appeared to be just another young professional unwinding after work. The weight of her service, the classified missions, the intense training that had shaped her into one of the Navy's elite warriors, all of it remained invisible beneath her casual exterior. Jennifer arrived 20 minutes late, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her designer heels clicking against the wooden floor. She worked in marketing for a tech company and lived in a world vastly different from Sarah's. As they embraced, Sarah felt the familiar disconnect between her two lives, the civilian world and the military one that few people could ever truly understand. "I'm so sorry I'm late," Jennifer said, sliding into the booth across from Sarah. "Traffic was insane, and then my boss called right as I was leaving." She paused, studying her friend's face. "You look different. Tired, maybe? Are you okay?" Sarah smiled, deflecting the concern with practiced ease. She had learned long ago that most people weren't ready to hear about the realities of her job. Instead, she asked about Jennifer's recent promotion and listened as her friend launched into stories about office politics and dating apps. The conversation felt both comforting and surreal, a reminder of the life she might have had if she'd chosen a different path. As the evening progressed, the bar filled with its usual crowd. Construction workers grabbed beers after their shifts, young professionals gathered for happy hour, and a few regulars claimed their spots at the bar. The atmosphere was relaxed, filled with laughter and the sound of clinking glasses. Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the normalcy of it all, the absence of hypervigilance that had become second nature in her professional life. Jennifer excused herself to use the restroom, leaving Sarah alone at the table with her thoughts. She watched the bartender efficiently serve customers, noting his quick movements and the way he kept track of multiple orders simultaneously. Her mind automatically cataloged exits, potential threats, and defensive positions, habits that never fully switched off no matter how safe the environment seemed. That's when she first noticed Marcus Thompson at the bar. He was a large man in his early 30s, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they'd seen physical work. His voice carried over the ambient noise as he complained loudly to anyone who would listen about his ex-wife, his job, and what he perceived as the unfairness of his life. Several people around him shifted uncomfortably, but Marcus seemed oblivious to their discomfort. Sarah observed him with the detached assessment she'd learned to apply to potential security threats. His speech was slightly slurred, suggesting he'd been drinking for a while before she and Jennifer had arrived. His body language was aggressive, with expansive gestures and a tendency to invade the personal space of others. Most concerning was the anger that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface, visible in the tension of his jaw and the way his hands clenched into fists when discussing his grievances. When Jennifer returned from the restroom, Sarah's attention shifted back to their conversation. They talked about their college professors, mutual friends who had gotten married or started families, and the different directions their lives had taken. Jennifer seemed fascinated by Sarah's stories about military life, though Sarah carefully edited them to focus on the camaraderie and travel rather than the danger and intensity of her actual missions. "Don't you ever worry about safety?" Jennifer asked, her concern genuine. I mean, being in the military and all. Sarah considered her answer carefully. How could she explain that she'd been trained to handle situations most people couldn't imagine? That her idea of safety had been permanently altered by experiences that had taught her to rely on herself and her team above all else? Instead, she offered a reassuring smile and said, "We have excellent training and support. I'm probably safer than you are walking to your car in the city." As the night wore on, Marcus's voice grew louder and his complaints more bitter. He spoke about women with an edge of resentment that made Sarah's skin crawl, describing his ex-wife in terms that revealed more about his character than hers. She noticed other patrons giving him a wide berth, and even the bartender seemed to be serving him with reluctant efficiency. "Some people just can't handle their alcohol," Jennifer observed, following Sarah's gaze toward Marcus. "Should we maybe move to a different table?" Sarah shook her head. She wasn't about to let one drunk man drive her away from a place where she felt comfortable. Besides, her training had prepared her for far worse situations than dealing with an intoxicated civilian in a public place. She trusted in her ability to de-escalate conflicts and, if necessary, defend herself and others. The conversation continued, but Sarah found herself splitting her attention between Jennifer and the increasingly volatile situation at the bar. Marcus had started making inappropriate comments to a young woman who was clearly trying to ignore him. The woman's friends had formed a protective circle around her, but Marcus seemed determined to press his unwanted attention. "Maybe we should call it a night," Jennifer suggested, sensing the change in atmosphere. She had noticed Sarah's divided attention and the tension that had crept into her friend's posture. "Let's finish our drinks first," Sarah replied, keeping her voice calm and casual. She didn't want to alarm Jennifer, but she also wasn't comfortable leaving while the situation with Marcus remained unresolved. Her instincts told her that he was escalating towards something more serious than just obnoxious behavior. As if summoned by her thoughts, Marcus suddenly pushed away from the bar, his face flushed with anger after the young woman had firmly rejected his advances. He began walking through the bar, his gait unsteady but purposeful, his eyes scanning the room with the predatory focus of someone looking for an easier target. His gaze settled on Sarah and Jennifer's table, and Sarah immediately recognized the shift in his demeanor. She had seen this look before, in training scenarios and real-world situations, the moment when someone's internal restraints gave way to their worst impulses. Marcus was no longer just drunk and obnoxious. He had become dangerous. "I think I'll get some air," Sarah said quietly to Jennifer, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. She needed to position herself strategically, to be ready for whatever was about to unfold. But, before she could move, Marcus was at their table, his imposing presence casting a shadow over their evening. The smell of alcohol and anger hung around him like a toxic cloud, and Sarah could see the calculations forming behind his bloodshot eyes as he assessed what he perceived to be two vulnerable women. Well, Marcus said, his voice carrying the false confidence of someone who had decided that intimidation was his path to feeling powerful again. "What do we have here?" "A couple of pretty ladies drinking all alone." Jennifer instinctively moved closer to Sarah, her discomfort obvious. Sarah remained perfectly still, her muscles coiled and ready, her mind already running through possible responses to whatever Marcus might do next. She hoped he would simply make his crude comments and move on, but something in his posture told her this confrontation was just beginning. The bar around them seemed to hold its breath, other patrons sensing the shift toward potential violence, but uncertain how to respond. The bartender looked up from the glass he was cleaning, his expression concerned but hesitant to intervene. In that moment, Sarah realized she was about to face her first real test of how her two worlds, military and civilian, would collide when pushed to their breaking point. Marcus Thompson swayed slightly as he stood over their table, his bulk blocking the light from the overhead fixture. Sarah could smell the whiskey on his breath mixed with something else, something that reminded her of the aggressive desperation she'd encountered in hostile situations overseas. Her training kicked in automatically, cataloging his stance, his hand positions, and the micro-expressions that would telegraph his next move. "I said, what do we have here?" Marcus repeated, his voice growing more insistent when neither woman immediately responded. His eyes focused on Sarah with a predatory intensity that made Jennifer shrink back against the booth's cushioned seat. Sarah met his gaze directly, her voice calm and measured. "We're just having a quiet conversation. Is there something you need?" She kept her hands visible on the table, non-threatening but ready to move if necessary. Her military training had taught her that sometimes the best way to avoid violence was to remain completely composed in the face of aggression. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Something I need? Yeah, I need people to show me some respect around here. You two think you're too good to acknowledge when a man is talking to you. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably beside Sarah, her voice small when she spoke. We didn't hear you at first. We were just talking. Her attempt at diplomacy only seemed to encourage Marcus, who interpreted her nervous politeness as submission. That's better, Marcus said, sliding uninvited into the booth next to Jennifer, forcing her to press closer to the wall. See, that wasn't so hard. Now, how about you ladies buy me a drink? I've had a rough day, and I could use some friendly company. The request was clearly not a request at all, but a demand backed by the implicit threat of his physical presence. Sarah assessed the situation quickly. The nearest exit was behind Marcus, about 15 feet away. The bartender was watching but seemed reluctant to intervene. Other patrons were pretending not to notice, a common response to domestic-style conflicts in public spaces. I think you should go back to the bar, Sarah said quietly, her tone still diplomatic but with an edge of steel that those who knew her would recognize as a warning. We're just here to catch up as friends. Marcus's expression darkened at what he perceived as defiance. Oh, we've got a tough one here, he said, turning his attention fully to Sarah. Let me guess, you think you're some kind of feminist, right? Think you don't need a man to take care of you. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat, but she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. She had faced down armed insurgents and hostile interrogators. She would not be intimidated by a drunk civilian, no matter how large he was. I think you've had too much to drink, and you should probably head home. The suggestion hit Marcus like a slap. In his alcohol-clouded mind, this small woman was challenging his authority, rejecting his advances, and, worse, doing it in front of other people. The fragile ego that had been bruised by his ex-wife's departure and his struggles at work couldn't handle another perceived humiliation. You think you can tell me what to do? Marcus's voice rose, drawing more attention from other patrons. You think because you're pretty, you can just dismiss me like I'm nothing? Jennifer tried to slide out of the booth, but Marcus grabbed her wrist, his large hand easily encircling it. Where do you think you're going, sweetheart? We're just getting acquainted. The physical contact crossed a line that Sarah's training would not allow her to ignore. Her voice dropped to a deadly calm that would have been recognized by her SEAL teammates as a final warning. Let go of her. Now, Marcus looked at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. He noticed the way she held herself, the absolute stillness that preceded action, and something in his primitive brain recognized danger. But alcohol and wounded pride overruled his survival instincts. Or what? Marcus sneered, tightening his grip on Jennifer's wrist until she winced. What are you going to do about it, little girl? Sarah stood up slowly, her movements controlled and precise. She was several inches shorter than Marcus and probably weighed 60 pounds less, but her presence suddenly filled the space around their table. Other patrons began to notice the confrontation, conversations quieting as people sensed the electricity in the air. I'm asking you politely one last time, Sarah said, each word carefully enunciated. Let go of my friend and walk away. Marcus released Jennifer's wrist, but only to stand and face Sarah directly. His size advantage was obvious, and he clearly believed it made him invincible. He had probably never encountered a woman who wouldn't back down from his intimidation tactics, and Sarah's calm defiance enraged him further. You know what your problem is? Marcus said, moving closer until he was invading Sarah's personal space. You need someone to teach you some manners. To show you what happens when women get too mouthy. Sarah didn't retreat, didn't flinch, didn't show any of the fear responses Marcus expected. Instead, she stood her ground with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced much worse threats than an angry drunk. Her stillness was complete, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Marcus, that's enough. The bartender's voice carried across the room as he finally decided to intervene. You need to leave. Now. But Marcus was beyond reasoning. The combination of alcohol, rejection, and public humiliation had pushed him past the point where logic or consequences mattered. He was operating purely on aggression and the need to reassert his dominance through force. Stay out of this, Marcus shouted at the bartender without taking his eyes off Sarah. This is between me and Miss Hine, mighty here. The bar had gone completely quiet now. All conversations stopped as people watched the confrontation unfold. Some patrons were reaching for their phones, presumably to call for help, while others were calculating their own exit strategies. The tension was palpable, like the moment before thunder follows lightning. Sarah remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled, her mind clear. She had been in similar situations countless times during her military career, facing down enemies who underestimated her because of her size and gender. She knew exactly how this would end if Marcus made the wrong choice. But she also knew that her primary goal was to de-escalate and protect civilians, including Marcus himself. "You have one more chance to walk away," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent room. "Choose wisely." Marcus's face flushed red with rage and humiliation. In his twisted logic, this woman's refusal to submit to his intimidation was the ultimate insult. Without warning, without any regard for consequences, he drew his hand back and struck Sarah across the face with an open-handed slap that echoed through the silent bar like a gunshot. The sound seemed to hang in the air for an eternal moment. Jennifer gasped. Someone dropped a glass behind the bar. A few patrons moved toward the exits. But Sarah simply stood there, her head turned slightly from the impact, her hand rising slowly to touch her reddened cheek. When she looked back at Marcus, her expression was completely calm, almost serene. But there was something in her eyes now, something that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward as his alcohol-clouded brain finally began to process what he had just done. "That," Sarah said softly, "was a mistake." The silence that followed Marcus's strike seemed to stretch forever. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hand still touching her cheek where his palm had connected. To Marcus, her lack of immediate retaliation must have seemed like submission, confirmation that his show of force had achieved its intended effect. He couldn't have been more wrong. Sarah's mind had shifted into a completely different mode, one that few civilians would ever witness. Every detail of the room crystallized with perfect clarity. She noted the position of every person within a 15-foot radius, calculated the exact distance to 3 separate exits, and assessed the weight distribution and probable fighting experience of the man standing before her. All of this happened in the space between heartbeats, the result of years of training that had become as natural as breathing. "Feel better now?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying an eerie calm that made several nearby patrons step back instinctively. "Did that make you feel like a big man?" Marcus, emboldened by what he misinterpreted as defeat, smiled with ugly satisfaction. "Sometimes women need to learn their place," he said, loud enough for the entire bar to hear. "Maybe now you'll show some respect." What happened next would be talked about in the anchor bar for years to come. Sarah moved with fluid precision, her actions so smooth and controlled that they seemed almost choreographed. In one seamless motion, she stepped forward, grabbed Marcus's extended wrist, and applied a joint lock that brought the much larger man to his knees with a sharp gasp of pain. "The first thing you should know," Sarah said conversationally, maintaining perfect control of the lock while Marcus struggled futilely against her grip, "is that I've been trained by the United States Navy to neutralize threats twice your size in about half the time it's taken me so far." Marcus's eyes went wide with shock and pain as he tried to process what was happening. The woman he had dismissed as an easy target was controlling him completely with what appeared to be minimal effort. His attempts to break free only resulted in more pain as Sarah adjusted her grip with practiced expertise. "The second thing you should know," Sarah continued, her voice never rising above a normal conversational tone, "is that I completed 3 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, where I learned to deal with men who think violence against women is acceptable." The revelation rippled through the bar like a shockwave. Jennifer stared at her friend in amazement, finally, understanding the controlled strength she had always sensed beneath Sarah's quiet exterior. The bartender reached for his phone but stopped, realizing that the situation was completely under control. Marcus tried to speak, to protest or plead, but the position Sarah held him in made it difficult to get enough air for more than short gasps. She adjusted her stance slightly, and his face went pale as new pressure points activated. "The third thing," Sarah said, glancing around the room to address the watching crowd as much as Marcus, "is that I took an oath to protect people from those who would abuse their size or strength to harm others. That includes protecting them from you." A man at the bar started to move forward, perhaps thinking he should intervene, but stopped when he saw the absolute control Sarah maintained over the situation. This wasn't a bar fight spiraling out of control. This was a trained professional dealing with a threat using the minimum necessary force. Sarah looked down at Marcus, who had stopped struggling, and was now focused entirely on the pain in his wrist and shoulder. "Here's what's going to happen," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm going to let you up. You're going to apologize to my friend and to everyone in this bar for your behavior. Then, you're going to leave and never come back. Are we clear?" Marcus nodded frantically, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The alcohol that had fueled his aggression now only made his situation worse, slowing his reflexes and clouding his judgment about how to respond to someone with Sarah's training and experience. Sarah released the lock and stepped back, but remained in a ready position. Marcus struggled to his feet, cradling his wrist and looking around the bar with embarrassment and confusion. The woman who had seemed so vulnerable just minutes before now appeared completely different to him, as if he had been looking at an optical illusion that had suddenly resolved into its true form. I'm sorry," Marcus mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know. I mean, I shouldn't have." "You shouldn't have hit anyone," Sarah said firmly. "Military training or not, what you did was assault. It was wrong when you thought I was just a civilian, and it's wrong now that you know I'm not." Jennifer found her voice for the first time since the confrontation began. "Sarah, you never told me you were." She trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "A Navy SEAL," Sarah completed quietly. "Most people don't need to know. I prefer to keep my professional and personal lives separate." She looked at Marcus, who was still rubbing his wrist and staring at her with something between fear and awe. "But sometimes people force me to bring them together." The bartender had been watching the entire exchange with fascination and growing respect. "Ma'am," he said, "your drinks are on the house. And, Marcus, you're banned. Permanently." Marcus nodded, his aggression completely deflated. The reality of what he had done, and what could have happened to him, was beginning to sink in through the haze of alcohol. He had assaulted a trained military operative in front of witnesses, and she had shown him mercy he probably didn't deserve. "I need to go," Marcus said, backing toward the exit. "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean. I wouldn't have." "Yes, you would have," Sarah said, cutting off his attempt at excuse-making. "You absolutely would have hit me if you thought I couldn't defend myself. That's exactly why you did hit me. The only thing my training changes is the consequences of that choice." Marcus reached the door and paused, looking back one more time. "How was I supposed to know?" he asked, a last desperate attempt to justify his actions. Sarah's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy for Marcus, but with sadness for the broader implications of his question. "You weren't supposed to know," she said. "You were supposed to not hit people regardless of whether they can defend themselves or not. That's how decent human beings behave." As the door closed behind Marcus, the normal sounds of the bar slowly resumed. Conversations started up again, though many of them centered on what people had just witnessed. Several patrons approached Sarah to express their admiration or to ask questions about her service, but she politely deflected most of them, wanting to return her focus to Jennifer and the evening they had planned. "I can't believe you never told me," Jennifer said when they were alone again. "All this time, and I had no idea what you really do." Sarah sat down across from her friend, suddenly, feeling the weight of the evening's events. "It's not that I didn't trust you," she explained. "It's just that most people treat you differently when they know. Some put you on a pedestal, some get uncomfortable, some want to hear war stories. I just wanted to be Sarah, your college roommate who happens to work for the Navy." Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "You're still that person to me. But now I understand why you always seemed so, I don't know, aware. Like you were always watching everything around you." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she had shown since Marcus approached their table. Occupational hazard. But tonight proved why that training matters, even in civilian life. People like Marcus count on others being too scared or too weak to stand up to them. The evening continued, but with a completely different energy. Other patrons occasionally glanced over at their table with respect and curiosity, and the bartender checked on them regularly. Word of the confrontation was already spreading, and Sarah knew that by tomorrow, the story would be told and retold throughout the neighborhood, probably growing in the telling. But for now, she was content to sit with her friend, talking about life and catching up on the normal things that made civilian life precious. The violence was over, justice had been served, and once again, her two worlds had intersected in a way that reminded her why both parts of her life mattered. The weeks following the incident at the Anchor Bar brought unexpected changes to Sarah's carefully compartmentalized life. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about the Navy SEAL who had taken down an aggressive drunk with surgical precision and remarkable restraint. While Sarah had hoped the story would fade away, she discovered that acts of heroism, even small ones, have a way of taking on a life of their own. Jennifer had been the first to grapple with the revelation about her friend's true profession. In the days immediately following their evening at the bar, she called Sarah repeatedly, asking questions that revealed how little civilians understood about military special operations. The conversations were sometimes awkward, as Jennifer struggled to reconcile the gentle, thoughtful woman she had known in college with the highly trained warrior who had effortlessly controlled a man twice her size. "I keep thinking about how calm you were," Jennifer said during one of their phone calls. "Even when he hit you, you didn't lose control or get angry. Is that something they teach you? Or is it just who you are?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The truth was that her natural temperament had made her well-suited for special operations training. But years of conditioning had certainly refined her ability to remain composed under pressure. Both, I guess. The training builds on what's already there. But, mostly, getting angry in a dangerous situation just makes things worse. Clear thinking saves lives. The conversation highlighted one of the challenges Sarah faced in bridging her two worlds. Military life operated on principles that could seem cold or calculating to civilians, but those same principles were what allowed special operations personnel to function effectively in life-or-death situations. Explaining that mindset to someone who had never faced such circumstances was like trying to describe color to someone who had been blind from birth. Meanwhile, the Anchor Bar had become something of a local legend. Tom, the bartender, found himself retelling the story multiple times each evening to new customers who had heard rumors and wanted confirmation. The story had grown in the telling, as stories do, with some versions claiming that Sarah had disarmed multiple attackers or that Marcus had been armed with a knife. Tom did his best to keep the facts straight, but he also understood that the mythologized version served an important purpose in the community. People need to believe that bullies can be stopped, he explained to Sarah when she returned to the bar a week later. What you did that night gave people hope that there are still consequences for that kind of behavior. Sarah understood his point, but she also worried about the implications of being seen as some kind of vigilante hero. Her military training emphasized the importance of proportional response and de-escalation, principles that could be lost if people focused only on the dramatic moment when she had taken control of Marcus. She didn't want to inspire others to seek confrontation or to believe that violence was the first response to aggression. The incident had also reached the attention of her commanding officers through unofficial channels. Commander Patricia Hayes, who supervised Sarah's unit, called her in for a conversation about maintaining operational security and the potential complications of public attention. "I'm not criticizing your actions," Commander Hayes assured Sarah during their meeting. "From what I understand, you handled the situation with appropriate restraint and professionalism. But we need to discuss the visibility this has created and how it might affect your future assignments." The conversation touched on one of the ongoing challenges faced by special operations personnel, particularly women in roles that remained relatively rare and newsworthy. Sarah's effectiveness as an operative depended partly on her ability to blend into civilian environments without drawing attention. While her actions at the bar had been completely justified, they had also created a level of local fame that could potentially compromise her operational effectiveness. "Have you considered a transfer to a training role?" Commander Hayes asked. "Your experience and demonstrated judgment would be valuable for instructing the next generation of operators. It would also allow you to stay in the area without the same operational security concerns." Sarah had not considered such a change, but the suggestion made her reflect on what she wanted from the next phase of her career. She loved the challenge and purpose of operational assignments, but she also recognized that her encounter with Marcus had revealed something about her desire to make a difference in civilian life as well. Back in the civilian world, Marcus Thompson was dealing with his own aftermath. The incident at the Anchor Bar had sobered him in more ways than one, forcing him to confront not only his drinking problem, but also his attitudes toward women and conflict resolution. The memory of being completely controlled by someone he had dismissed as weak haunted him, but not in the way his friends might have expected. Rather than feeling humiliated or seeking revenge, Marcus found himself experiencing something closer to gratitude. In his clearer moments, he realized that Sarah could have seriously injured him or had him arrested for assault. Instead, she had chosen to teach him a lesson and let him walk away with nothing more than a bruised ego and a sore wrist. The realization prompted Marcus to seek help, first from a counselor at a Veterans Affairs office. He had served briefly in the Army National Guard years earlier. and then from an alcohol treatment program. The counselor helped him understand that his anger and aggression stemmed from feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy that alcohol had amplified rather than resolved. You attacked someone you thought was vulnerable because it made you feel strong, the counselor explained during one of their sessions. But real strength comes from protecting people, not hurting them. That woman showed you what real strength looks like. Marcus began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, where his story of the confrontation with Sarah became part of his journey toward sobriety. He spoke about it not as a humiliating defeat, but as a moment when someone had shown him a different way to handle conflict and adversity. I thought being a man meant never backing down, never showing weakness, Marcus told his AA group during one meeting. But she showed me that real strength is about control, about choosing not to hurt people even when you have the power to do it. The ripple effects of that one evening continued to spread through the community in unexpected ways. Several women who had heard the story approached Sarah to share their own experiences with harassment and assault, finding in her example a source of strength and validation. Some asked if she could teach them basic self-defense, leading Sarah to volunteer her time at a local community center offering women's safety classes. Teaching civilians gave Sarah a new perspective on her military skills and experience. The women who came to her classes were not seeking to become warriors. They simply wanted to feel safer and more confident in their daily lives. Sarah found that adapting her training to civilian needs required her to think differently about force, fear, and empowerment. The goal isn't to turn you into a Navy SEAL, she would tell each new class. The goal is to give you options and confidence. Most conflicts can be avoided or de-escalated, but if someone does attack you, you should know that you're not helpless. The classes became popular, with word of mouth bringing women from throughout the area. Sarah discovered that she enjoyed teaching, particularly when she could see the transformation in her students' confidence and self-awareness. The work felt like a natural extension of her military mission to protect others, but applied in a context that touched her civilian community directly. Jennifer, meanwhile, had begun attending the self-defense classes, partly to better understand her friend's capabilities and partly because the incident at the bar had awakened her own awareness of personal safety issues she had previously ignored. The classes brought them closer together, giving them a shared activity that bridged their different life experiences. I never realized how much I took my safety for granted, Jennifer admitted after one particularly intense training session. Just walking to my car at night, or being alone in an elevator with a stranger. I always assumed nothing bad would happen to me. Sarah nodded, understanding that one of the unintended consequences of her military service was a realistic awareness of how quickly situations could turn dangerous. Awareness doesn't mean living in fear, she explained. It means being prepared and making smart choices. Most people are good, but it only takes one bad encounter to change everything. As the months passed, the incident at the Anchor Bar evolved from a dramatic confrontation into a foundational story that had reshaped multiple lives. Sarah found herself at the center of a small but growing community of people who had been touched by that evening's events, either directly or through the stories that had grown around it. The experience had also clarified something important for Sarah about her own future. While she remained committed to her military service, she had discovered a calling that extended beyond her operational duties. Whether through teaching, community involvement, or simply being an example of strength used responsibly, she realized that her skills and experience could make a difference in civilian life in ways she had never previously considered. The transformation was subtle but significant, representing a bridge between the two worlds she had always kept separate. For the first time, Sarah began to see how her military service and her civilian life could complement rather than compete with each other, creating opportunities to serve and protect that extended far beyond the scope of any single mission or assignment. 6 months after the incident at the Anchor Bar, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the local university, preparing to give a speech she never could have imagined herself making. The university's Women's Safety Initiative had invited her to speak about personal security and empowerment, and the response had been overwhelming. Students, faculty, and community members filled every seat, with many standing along the walls. The invitation had come through Dr. Rebecca Chun, a psychology professor who had heard about Sarah's self-defense classes and her unique perspective on violence prevention. Dr. Chun had been researching the psychology of victimization and was particularly interested in how military training could be adapted for civilian self-protection without promoting unnecessary aggression. What makes your approach different? Dr. Chun had explained during their initial meeting, is your emphasis on de-escalation and appropriate response. Too many self-defense programs focus on fighting back without teaching people how to avoid fights in the first place. Sarah had been reluctant to accept the speaking engagement at first. Public speaking had never been part of her military duties, and she worried about further increasing her visibility in the community. However, Commander Hayes had encouraged her to accept, seeing it as an opportunity to build positive relationships between the military and civilian communities. As Sarah looked out at the audience, she saw faces that represented the full spectrum of human experience. There were young college students who had never faced serious violence, older women who carried the scars of past trauma, and men who wanted to better understand how to be allies in creating safer communities. In the front row, she spotted Jennifer, who had become one of her strongest supporters, and Marcus Thompson. Marcus's presence was perhaps the most surprising development of the past 6 months. After completing his alcohol treatment program, he had asked Tom, the bartender, if he could somehow contact Sarah to thank her personally. The request had led to a carefully arranged meeting, supervised by both Tom and Jennifer, where Marcus had offered a formal apology and asked if there was any way he could contribute to her community safety work. I know I can't undo what I did, Marcus had said during that meeting, but I want to do something positive with what I learned. If there's any way I can help prevent other men from making the choices I made, I'd like to try. Sarah had been skeptical at first, but Marcus's sincerity and his commitment to his recovery program had gradually convinced her. He had become an unexpected advocate for her work, using his own story as an example of how toxic masculinity and substance abuse could lead to violence, and how intervention and accountability could lead to change. Good evening, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium. 6 months ago, I was just trying to have a quiet drink with a friend. I had no intention of becoming a public speaker, a self-defense instructor, or an example of anything. But sometimes life pushes us in directions we never expected, and we have to decide whether to resist that push or learn from it. She told the story of that evening at the Anchor Bar, but with a perspective shaped by months of reflection and the insights she had gained from working with survivors of violence and perpetrators seeking change. She spoke about the moment of decision when Marcus had struck her, and how her training had provided her with options that allowed her to respond without escalating the violence unnecessarily. The goal was never to humiliate or punish, Sarah explained. The goal was to stop the immediate threat and create an opportunity for everyone to step back and make better choices. Violence should always be the last resort, not the first response, even when you have the capability to win a fight. Dr. Chun had asked Sarah to address the psychology of both victims and aggressors, drawing on her military experience with conflict resolution and her civilian work with community safety. Sarah spoke about the importance of recognizing early warning signs of aggressive behavior, the value of trusting instincts about potentially dangerous situations, and the techniques for de-escalating confrontations before they became physical. Awareness is your first and best defense, she told the audience. Most predators rely on people being distracted, isolated, or unprepared. Simple changes in how you carry yourself, how you observe your surroundings, and how you position yourself in potentially risky situations can dramatically reduce your chances of becoming a target. She demonstrated basic situational awareness techniques, showing how to scan environments for exits, potential weapons, and sources of help. The military precision of her observations impressed the audience, but she was careful to emphasize that these skills could be learned by anyone willing to practice them regularly. The second layer of defense is verbal de-escalation, Sarah continued. Most conflicts can be resolved without physical confrontation if you understand how to communicate with someone who is angry, intoxicated, or emotionally disturbed. This requires staying calm, avoiding inflammatory language, and looking for ways to give the aggressor an exit that preserves their dignity. Marcus had worked with Sarah to develop this part of her presentation, offering insights into the mindset of someone who becomes violent and what approaches might have reached him before the situation escalated. His perspective had been invaluable in helping her understand the psychological factors that drive aggressive behavior and the intervention points where conflict could be redirected. The third layer, Sarah said, moving into the physical self-defense portion of her presentation, is knowing how to protect yourself if verbal de-escalation fails. But this isn't about becoming a warrior or seeking confrontation. It's about having options when your safety is threatened and using the minimum force necessary to escape or neutralize the threat. She demonstrated several basic techniques, emphasizing that the goal was always to create an opportunity to get away rather than to subdue or punish an attacker. Her movements were precise and efficient, clearly the result of extensive training, but she adapted them for people with no military or martial arts background. Most importantly, Sarah stressed, know your own capabilities and limitations. Don't let confidence turn into overconfidence. The techniques I'm showing you can be effective, but they require practice and appropriate judgment about when to use them. Sometimes the best self-defense is running away, calling for help, or complying with an attacker's demands if your life is at stake. During the question and answer period that followed, Sarah addressed concerns about the psychological impact of violence, both on victims and on those who have to defend themselves. She spoke honestly about the emotional challenges of military service and how her training had prepared her to compartmentalize traumatic experiences while still processing them in healthy ways. Fighting back successfully doesn't erase the trauma of being attacked, she explained to one questioner. Taking control of a dangerous situation can be empowering, but it's important to seek support afterward. Violence affects everyone involved, even when you're the one who wins. A young woman near the back of the auditorium raised her hand and asked a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. How do you deal with people who think women shouldn't learn to fight back? I've had friends tell me that self-defense classes just make women more likely to be hurt because they'll resist when they should submit. Sarah's response drew on both her military experience and her work with civilian survivors of violence. That argument assumes that compliance guarantees safety, which statistics tell us is not true. Predators aren't reasonable people who will honor an implicit contract of submission in exchange for safety. But, more importantly, the goal of self-defense training isn't just physical protection. It's about developing confidence, awareness, and options. Those benefits extend far beyond any single dangerous encounter. Marcus raised his hand, and Sarah nodded for him to speak. I want to say something as someone who was on the wrong side of this situation, he said, his voice carrying to the back of the auditorium. Before I got help for my drinking and anger problems, I targeted people I thought were weak or wouldn't fight back. Lieutenant Martinez's training didn't make the situation more dangerous. It ended it quickly and safely. If she had been just another victim, I would have hurt her more, not less. His words carried weight precisely because of his unique perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the confrontation. The audience listened intently as he continued. The work she's doing now, teaching people to protect themselves and helping men like me understand the impact of our behavior, that's what actually prevents violence. Pretending that bad people don't exist doesn't protect anyone. After the formal presentation ended, Sarah was surrounded by people wanting to thank her, ask additional questions, or share their own experiences. She listened to stories of harassment, assault, and fear, but also tales of successful de-escalation and moments when training or awareness had prevented dangerous situations from developing. Jennifer approached her as the crowd began to thin. I'm so proud of you, she said, giving Sarah a warm hug. You've taken something terrible and turned it into something that's helping so many people. Dr. Chen joined them, her expression thoughtful. I'd like to discuss the possibility of developing a formal curriculum based on your approach, she said. What you've created here could be adapted for high schools, colleges, and community organizations across the country. The combination of practical skills and psychological insight is exactly what we need to address violence prevention comprehensively. As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that night at the Anchor Bar. The incident that had initially seemed like an unfortunate encounter with a drunk stranger had evolved into a catalyst for personal and professional growth she never could have anticipated. Her military service continued, but she had also accepted Commander Hayes' suggestion to transition into a training role that allowed her to stay in the area and continue her civilian community work. The new position would involve developing curriculum for urban warfare and civilian protection scenarios, drawing on her operational experience and her growing expertise in violence prevention. The self-defense classes had evolved into a nonprofit organization called Capable Communities, which provided training not just in physical self-defense, but in conflict resolution, bystander intervention, and trauma recovery. Marcus had become one of the organization's most effective advocates, speaking to men's groups about toxic masculinity and the responsibility to intervene when they witnessed aggressive behavior. Sarah had also begun working with law enforcement agencies, helping to train officers in de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity when dealing with veterans and military families. The work bridged her military and civilian worlds in ways that felt natural and meaningful, allowing her to serve and protect on multiple levels. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from a young woman who had attended that evening's presentation. "Thank you for tonight," the message read. "I was assaulted last year, and I've been afraid ever since. Your talk made me realize I can take back some control. I'm signing up for your classes." Similar messages had become common, each one representing someone whose life might be changed by the tools and perspective Sarah was sharing. The ripple effects of that confrontation with Marcus continued to spread, touching lives and creating positive change in ways that reminded her why she had chosen a career dedicated to protecting others. The evening at the Anchor Bar had ended with Sarah touching her bruised cheek and telling Marcus that hitting her had been a mistake. Now, months later, she could see that his mistake had become the foundation for something much larger, a community-wide conversation about violence, prevention, and the power of choosing protection over aggression. In turning one man's moment of violence into a catalyst for positive change, Sarah had discovered a mission that would define the next chapter of her life, both in and out of uniform.